everyone for coming. We'll just give a couple more minutes. I think we're still waiting for Jennifer Fimbel. Oh, there she is. Great. So Jennifer's on and Brent is on and I'm on. So we are going to get going here. Thank you everyone for coming. Again, this is our second Dutchess County Sheep and Wool Growers Association lecture of our seminar series this year. I'm Gillian Ferguson and I'm happy to be one of the speakers today. And we will be starting with Jennifer Fimbel, who will be chatting a little bit about pasture management. I will then chat a little bit about parasite management from a veterinary perspective. And then Brent will say how it all works in real life practicality of doing it in the field, as it were. Again, we're happy to have you and happy to host these events. Certainly would recommend, if you like these, if you're interested, if you've got suggestions, let us know about them and join us. There's a lot of information at our website on the Dutchess County Sheep and Wool Growers Association. If we're trying to do a little bit more than just the sheep and wool show. We're trying to get some education stuff out there, and we're happy to have any suggestions that you might have. So Jennifer Fimbel is our first speaker from the Cornell Cooperative Extension, and also has a ton of experience in sheep raising and management, in addition to being a member of the Cornell Cooperative for several years. So I'm going to stop my screen share. Jennifer, are you on audio right now?
I am right now.
Perfect. All right, let's see if this works. Okay. Does it let you share your screen? That's the big thing. Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Yay, how about that? Hi there, everybody. I've been with Extension for a very long time, 36 years. Let's see, next week I start 37 years. I started the week of the Dutchess County Fair, so that's always kind of like the big homecoming. I do have kind of two positions. They are both with the Cornell Cooperative Extension Office, one as a senior resource educator with Livestock and Equine, and the other one is called the Ag Navigator for Dutchess County, where I work with municipal officials like assessors, planning boards, supervisors to educate them on matters pertaining to agriculture. So if you ever run into a problem with a Dutchess County assessor, give me a buzz and I can certainly let you get some information and help you out as much as I can. So I have all of about 20 minutes to talk about pasture management. So I'm going to stick to the basics. There were some questions that were a little bit more detailed, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to cover those. We can try, but we'll see how we make out. So why do you want to manage your pastures? Oops, and there we go. That's not what I wanted to do. There we go. Why do we want to manage our pastures? Well, you are stewards of the land, and you'll have better relationships with your neighbors and your local government. You'll improve your water quality. Your sheep will enjoy eating grasses rather than weeds. Grasses act as a filter strip to prevent nitrates, phosphorus, and pathogens from our water supplies. And managed pasture land will also reduce erosion over waterways by holding the soil in place and preventing it from allowing the soil to wash away. So tonight we're going to talk about the placement of grazing areas, soil types, the soil needs, the seeds and grasses that you might want to use, and excuse me, animal density or stocking rate. So pasture placement, size, and shape. Ideally, pastures should be located on relatively flat areas with no steep inclines. However, if you're doing lambs for meat, you might want some water at one end of a hill and feed at the other end of the hill. That depends on how you raise your animals. It should relate to the number of animals expected to be grazing in the field, and we're going to talk about that. Enough room should be set aside so that you can rotate animals in and out of different areas. And the shape of the field is preferably rectangular or square. That sort of helps prevent highly trampled areas, or what we call sacrifice areas. Soil type and quality. So if you've never used the NRCS from USDA, the NRCS mapping tool, it's a great tool to see what kind of soils you have. It won't tell you soil fertility, but it will tell you what kinds of soils and what they're good for. So if you have a lot of forested land, you might find it it's really shallow, very little topsoil, which isn't great for growing grasses. So if you ever want to just look up NRCS web soil survey, you plug in your physical address, and you can use the mapping tool, outline the area, and find out what kind of soils you have. Or Lauren Drum, who's a sheep and wool growers member, or myself can certainly walk you through the process. It's really very easy. Once you do it once, you're like, oh, okay, that's not so bad. So the type of soil, how well drained it is, and the soil type will all relate to how well your pasture mixes will grow. So you need to choose your seed mixtures based on that, not the other way around. Now, a lot of people want to just, well, I want to have this kind of grass or this kind of legume. You really need to make sure that your soil is appropriate to grow that in the best way. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time doing a lot of renovation to get your pastures to where you want them to be. So for instance, if you have a kind of a wet area, you might want to put in something that grows better in wetlands like reed canary grass, which isn't the best tasting grass, but it certainly does well in a very wet area. So there are grasses, there are plants that do well in a wetter area. I always recommend that people do soil testing and look at the analysis. It is a crop. Pastures are really considered a crop. They're feeding your animals. So that's a crop, just like corn, oats, soybeans, anything else that we're growing, alfalfa. You really need to sample this soil. And the best way to do that is to look at the areas that you want to have analyzed as a rectangle. And I tell people, make the letter Z or the letter M through the entire grazing area. Take plugs of soil 4 to 6 inches down, because that's where the roots are growing for any of those plants. All the way through, you combine that all together. And if the lay of the land is similar, so if it's like a hilltop or just a hillside or a valley floor, that's where you just need one soil sample. But if you've got a lot of rolling hills in your area, or some wet areas and some very dry areas or rocky areas, you might want to go through and get those as separate analysis. The cost is about $25, but the results are good for 3 years. And if you change your mind and you decide, well, you know what, I want to add legumes to this, but I don't want to pay $25 to have the whole thing redone, you can call the lab after it's done once and change your mind, and they'll rerun it and you'll be fine. They'll give you actually new results. We send it to Agro One, and they'll determine if you need fertilizer and or lime for your fields. Lime will change the pH. Most grasses, it's as long as it's about 6.0 for your pH or above, you're fine. If it's below that, you might need some lime to go with that, and that'll tell you exactly how many tons per acre that you would need to apply. The addition of fertilizer and lime to your pastures will ensure quality growth when it's applied appropriately. So what does that mean? It means that in the spring, that's when you should put down some of your fertilizer. And again, just like a hayfield, just before your second cutting, say the very end of June, beginning of July, if it's not too dry then. We don't recommend to fertilize in the fall, because it promotes, nitrogen will promote the green part of the plant growing up, and you're liable to get a lot of frost kill once we do get a hard killing frost. You certainly can do phosphorus or potassium to promote root growth, but why fertilize more times than you have to? The more times you're on your soil like that, the more compacted your soils will be, the more difficult it is to get that good soil to seed contact to grow the fields effectively. Lime can be applied in the spring and or the fall. So that's always a good thing. It gives you, but it takes several months for lime to do its job. So if you plan on seeding next spring or adding some top dress seed to your fields, then you may want to lime this fall if it's needed. It takes about 2 weeks for those samples to come back. They will be emailed to you if you provide them with an email address. If you're in Dutchess County, they come back to our office, and you can, if you have questions about what the worksheet looks like, you can always call me. One note that if you need a lot of lime, so if you need 3 tons or more per acre, we recommend definitely a split application on that. No more than that. It looks like it snowed in your field, and it takes a lot longer for it to get washed into the soil before the sheep can really go out there and graze again. So let's talk about the different kinds of things you can grow in your pastures. So grasses are obviously probably number one. 60% of when sheep are browsing, they are grazing. They're actually grazing the grasses more than they are forbs and legumes. So it's about a 60-40 choice. So grasses really are the mainstay of your pasture. What I usually recommend to people is that you want to have several different types of grass. You want a cool weather grass, so that's for your early spring grasses and for your fall, a warm weather grass, and even a hot weather grass. So orchard grass is a great cool weather grass. It's a clump grass. As long as you mow it once it's done, before it seeds out, you will have great grass pretty much all season, except about this time of year. Kentucky bluegrass is great. It's a great grazing grass. It really only does well, not really, but kind of like for the month of June, but it gets you through. And then brome grass, even though it's expensive, is a hot weather grass and tends to do better. Some people say, well, what about Timothy? Timothy is a biennial. So that means it has to be reseeded every couple of years. It doesn't really reseed itself well, and it doesn't graze well. That's why we use it for hay, because you're only doing 2 or 3 cuttings, but to graze it, it just doesn't stand up. Perennial rye is great in your high traffic areas because it's a little hardier. It can, so by your gate areas, your water areas, and if you're feeding outside, it can withstand some of that tromping. And fescue is a great grass. It's not the most palatable, but sheep will eat it once it's some of the other things have gone by. But please make sure that it's endophyte free. The endophyte is what's in a lawn mix in fescue, and it can cause abortion, usually in beef cattle and in horses, but I put sheep in the same category. So it's just something that I would, be aware of. Get the endophyte free if you're going to mix your own seed mixes. You can buy regular mixes that are already packaged together. If you want more legumes, I tend to say if you're going to get a packaged mix, no more than 10% clover in it. Either red or white, because clover this time of year, if you look at your pastures and in the overgrazed areas, the clovers have kind of taken over. So it's something you just want to be aware of. So legumes have more leafiness with less structure. Thus, grasses tend to have more digestible fiber than legumes. Legumes, due to their abundant leaves, often have more protein, energy, and micronutrients as compared to grasses. So that's why you want some legumes in your fields. Alfalfa is one. The Empire bird's foot trefoil is another, but that takes about 2 years to really truly establish. But once it's there, it does a pretty good job. Clover, the red and the white. Somebody had asked about Lespedeza. It's more commonly used in the Southeast. There may be some varieties that work here in maybe the southern part of the Northeast, but it's not really one of the favored ones that's recommended for this area, just because we don't have a variety that grows really well here. There is some research that's been shown that possibly can provide some protection or control of parasites. So the problem with like having too many legumes, as most of you already know this, is bloat. And so when animals such as sheep, cows, goats, eat too much, even llamas and alpacas, there's a lot of gas that's produced because of all those leaves, the excess water. So it causes, bloat, and that's an issue that you don't want to have. And again, that's why you don't want too much clover in your fields. There's some research that says yes, and some research that says no, that some of the clovers aren't so great during breeding season, for either abortion or whatever else down the road. So it's one of those things. I think the jury's still out on that. A lot of the old school said, don't let them in a field of just clover. I wouldn't anyway. I really do like a dynamic pasture that's got a lot of varieties of, a lot of varieties of things for them to eat. So biodiversity is a good thing, especially in your pastures. So forbs are a little different. So this is actually a picture of chicory. There are some people that do use chicory on a regular basis. It's a high value crop that has some valuable advantages for your livestock. They are known for their exceptionally high energy levels and have high protein levels of 20 to 23%. Forbs are a very mineral rich grazing herb. Two forbs that are very good and fit for pasture grazing are chicory and plantain. And so plantain, you may go, oh, well, but sheep will eat it. It's probably not their first choice, but they will eat some of it. So again, mixing it in there is obviously can be a good thing. And I'm going to preface a lot of this by saying you have to do what works for you and your operation. If you're growing lambs and you really want a lot of high protein, right away to really bulk them up and get them going quickly, yes, that's what you're going to use. You're going to use more legumes and forbs in your fields, and you're going to watch for bloat. You're going to do something to prevent bloat in your lambs. But if you've got a bunch of older ewes and they're 5-6 years old, they're kind of getting to the end of their breeding cycle, you may not want to have that high protein. You may go with grasses that are a little different. So you really have to know what kind of operation you've got and what you want it to be, and then go with those seeds and those plants that actually do best just for your operation. None of you are the same. None of you raise your sheep the same. So it's they're not cookie cutters. Stocking rate. I'm asked this a lot. I know Lauren is asked this. Dr. Ferguson said she's asked this question a lot. So I'm going to give you some generalities. 1 acre of land, again, depending on the quality of the pasture, can support about 500 pounds of grazing animal. And that goes for horses, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens. It's one of those things that it just seems to work. And then it will still leave you some grass or some forage available to the animals. So that translates almost, depending upon the breed, 4 to 5 sheep per acre, depending on obviously several factors. The amount of time each pasture has sheep grazing on it. Is it 24/7, or are you rotating once a day? Are you rotating them every week? Are you rotating them never in the summer at all? How many animals you've got there? How much supplementation, so hay and grain? And how much rotation is available for you to go ahead and rotate them away? And with the soil, the pasture types, fertility, and the health of the overall pasture itself. So when we had sheep, my daughter Megan had sheep, and we didn't have a huge, I think it was a 10-acre field. And we didn't have a 3-sided shed in both sides of that field. And one side was really close to the wooded land, a lot of coyotes there. We did have a guard llama. She did a great job. But what we chose to do was during the wintertime, the sheep were on the upper half where the 3-sided shed was. They came in for lambing. So, as a group, you get the 2 or 3 that are closest to lambing, brought them into the barn. They lambed there. Lambs were there. We had a small sacrifice area for lambs to be out in, another area for yearlings to be out in. And then by the time everybody had lambed and there was actually spring was actually here, those who were being weaned would go back out on that upper pasture. There was very little grass in there. And by the time everybody was being weaned, all the sheep, all the ewes have been weaned, they were drying up on basically, it wasn't a dirt lot, but the grass was very, very short. And that gave the lower side with no shed on it an opportunity to grow up. And if it grew too fast, depending on the weather, then we would brush hog it down a little bit before the ewes actually went out there. And that worked for us. So the ewes would go down there, and the field down below with no, they had a hedgerow for shade. They go down there during the day and come back up at night. And by this time in the year, that actually the upper pasture actually recouped itself. Now we might have to go out and dig out some thistle or something, you know, some of the odd burdock or something like that, but it was manageable. And that's what worked for us. Ideally, I would have loved to have had it divided into 4 different areas, keep them on those areas for just a week or so and rotate them around. It just wasn't feasible. So you really have to go with what works for your operation. Again, everybody's so different and what you have available to you. Your pasture, you know, you may have to actually load the sheep up and move them somewhere in a trailer. So it really, you know, I think you have to take a look. Don't take everything that I'm saying as hardcore. There's a lot of flexibility in this. All right. So a maintenance of a sheep pasture, any pasture actually, soil test every 3 years. So $25, $30 for 3 years is a pretty good price. Follow the recommendations. Plan out your rotational areas and where you can, and whether you have to use some high tensile fence, whether you have to use electric net fencing, or if you're just using your livestock, you know, welded wire type fencing, whatever works for you, get it planned out now for next year. And I see how that works. And you may find you have to increase some sizes of different ones. You know, there's no set amount of time that they should be on an area. Don't forget to mow. People do forget to mow their fields. If you mow them out, mow them over before the weeds seed out, you are going to have beautiful pastures, guaranteed. But if you wait till they all seed out, all you're broadcasting seed, and you're just kind of spreading the weeds around, and you're going, wow, I have to reside. So it's something that you really do need to do, and you really need to pay attention to it. So when you go out to go, you know, check the sheep or check the fence line, walk through the field a little bit, inspect the pastures for weeds, see where they're at in their growth cycle. You know, you see them start to head out a little bit or flower, that's the time you need to brush hog. You really do. Check the grass height, rotate the high traffic areas. So those gate areas, you might, you know, if you have, if you have 50 sheep in one area, rotate yet where your gate is actually set up, because that's going to just trample that one area with 50 sets of hooves on there. So it's just something to really think about. So exceptions to some of these rules. In the spring, you want to let the grass grow to about 4 to 6 inches high. It sounds awfully short, but it really does work. If you want to leave some high patches for them to bed down in, or if you've got livestock guardian dogs, that's a great thing to do. But if the grasses overall are too high, it gives the coyotes a great place to hide as well. So just thinking about that, take a look at some people that you really admire what they've done with their pastures and see what they've done, and you can come and model yours after that. We made sure our fence lines were actually shorter because we wanted to make sure the coyotes couldn't get in there and sneak in. So then you graze in the spring just to 4 inches or so, and you remove the sheep. They have to go to the next rotational area. Then you mow to remove any weed heads that come up, but it also regenerates the grasses so that they will come on stronger. Their root growth will be really strong. And then you have to allow for regrowth to that 4 to 6 inch height. And that takes in the springtime 10 to 15 days. This means you're mowing every 10 to 15 days unless you want to hay that field, which you can do that as well. In a droughty time, like right now, if you coulda, woulda, shoulda, allow your pasture to grow to 8 inches high back in the end of June before we really started getting super dry. Graze it down to 4 to 6 inches high, remove the sheep, mow to remove the weed heads, and allow for regrowth if we're going to get any with the lack of rain, because we are now in more than a moderate drought. But normally it takes 45 to 60 days to regrow. So that's a long time. So planning those rotational areas is really important. How long you might need. So in the you may have a 10-acre field, and you'll divide it into 4 grazing areas for the spring, and by August it's just one great big grazing area because that's all you've got. It's possible you can do that, but then in the fall, this is the time of year you want to think about reseeding, getting those, what kind of seeds you want to add to your fields. and really take a look at them now, even though they're probably browning up pretty well. If you have, people are afraid to mow because they're, I don't want to mow. Well, sheep won't have anything to eat, but they're eating whatever's down low. They really, truly are. They do prefer those, springier grasses that are underneath. They're a little bit greener. They're a little bit more lush than that dry stuff that's like hay on top. That's kind of where we go with that. Again, you have to work with what works for you and planning that. It's difficult. It takes a number of years to really, really do a good job with it. I think, we didn't have a lot of land to rotate out, but if some of you, Gillian's been she was at the place where we used to keep sheep. Those fields always look pretty decent. Except in February or March when they were all, the use for the grass in that one field was really low, but that's what you want. You want to wean them off on less grass. But again, if I could have, we would have divided those up even further and just rotated them more. So there's some great resources out there. See, I tried to keep to, good job. So there's a bunch of resources there. I don't have a way to print them out and send them to you, but Small Farms has got a great one on perfect pastures. Vermont's got some really good ones. Illinois actually has some. So, take a look at those, take a look at different ones. Again, nobody raises their animals the same way you do. So you can look at one and say, oh, that sounds great. And it's not going to work for you. Maybe it's too much labor. I don't want to be out there, brush hogging every 10 days or 14 days in the spring. This is just not going to work. I'll hay it then instead. That's fine. That works. So, just remember that it's just take a look at what you've got now and see what you need to add to it for the future. So Gillian, I don't know if you want questions now. That's what I've got. So
yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So what I think we should do for questions, guys, is put it in the chat box. So that little menu on the bottom of the page that has the chat thing, you can click there if you have any questions, just so nobody gets, talking over each other or anything. But if you've got any questions for Jennifer, feel free to type it into the chat box and then we can answer anything.
I know that somebody had asked about organic for organic fields or not. You can buy organic fertilizers, but what I've just told you really is about as non-invasive for soil health as you're going to possibly get. If it needs nitrogen, you're going to have to buy nitrogen, whether you get an organic source or not. If it needs potassium and phosphorus, that's what you're going to have to do. Lime is not a bad thing to add to it. It really isn't. And it can do some really good things if you've got low soil pH. And if you find that your soils are really compacted, meaning that you've got a lot of ponding, even though you're maybe up on a hilltop, maybe there's some clay or something like that in your soils, getting an aerator out, in the spring to aerate those soils up, because if you've had either beef cattle or horses on the property, sometimes that does compact your soils. Yes, you can use pelletized lime as long as it starts to disintegrate. So I always tell people, really watch the weather, really become you're going to be a grass farmer. Hope for rain and say, okay, I'm going to lime because in 2 days we're supposed to have a good soaking rain. You've got the sheep, taken off of there. And then it doesn't take long to get, as long as it's safe for livestock in general. If it's safe for horses, for lime, it's good for sheep. But yeah, a lot of people use pelletized lime on their pastures. What's the other one I missed? Let's see. Second question. Yeah, for your next rotations, I know, yes. So our pastures are dry and short right now. I'm not sure what to do for the next rotations. It seems like the pastures have barely grown since the last rotation cycle due to lack of rain. Yeah, no, that's absolutely. And so right now you're supplementing with hay, and hay is going to go out of sight. It's so if you think about your pastures, those hay guys, that's their cash crop is second cutting grass hay, because that's what all the horse people like. First cutting hay wasn't so bad, but a lot of them didn't add fertilizer this year because of the cost of fertilizer. So you're going to have to really weigh what those costs are. Get some hay from somewhere that that you can afford. Try supplementing with some hay for now. I hate to tell you that, but it's this time of year. Plan for hopefully September is usually a little bit more rainy, and just hope that it goes that route. Just keep an eye on the weather forecast, and get some seed spread out there as soon as it looks like rain's going to be in the forecast. Put it out there. We still put them out on the short grass pastures. It depends on the quality of the sod base underneath. If it was really nice and thick this spring, you may be able to do it. I would just do light grazing, which means either putting up some electric fence to kind of divvy up that grazing area, and only keep them on there for a day or two and just keep rotating them out. That's about all you can do at this point. Drought is drought for everybody. It's a really tough thing to do. Sorry about that. I wish I had a magic cure for that. I generally mow after sheep rotation in order. Whoops. Hold on. I generally mow after a sheep rotation in order to suppress plants that sheep won't eat. Yes. In particular, I find much sedge in wetter areas. Yes. Just keep seeding down. A lot of times, so maybe somewhat like reed canary grass. Again, it's not the most palatable, but it's more palatable than the sedges. They won't eat those. And you really have to get after those, if you can spot, either till, or, if it's not huge areas, or if it's just interspersed, I'm not sure which one it is. Sedges tend to like certain areas. So you may have to just fence that off and really intensively either till it up and try again, knowing that the sedge, before they go kind of to seed, and really try to break that cycle. If you want to plant something like turnips in there or something like that, the sheep can eat in the wintertime, that's fine, that works. Pumpkins, you can do that too. That kind of helps, take care of that if it's wet enough there. If not, try some, reed canary grass mix with some other of the other grasses.
Great. Well, thank you.
You're very
everyone.
welcome.
All right.
Thanks for listening.
Sure. We'll hang out. We got more to come.
Yep.
So one more question from Jerry to Jennifer, and then we're going to move on. So what's the best way to overhaul
your fields that way without heavy machinery? Four-wheelers, if you can do it, but it's you're going to have to go in once in a while, and a tractor on good sod isn't going to hurt it. It really truly isn't. If they're already compacted, soils are already compacted, you really ought to go ahead and get them, aerated anyway. But if they're not, if they're okay, then, a regular tractor going over, once a month or once every couple of weeks is not going to hurt them, with a brush hog. That's really, because most of you have smaller areas, the lime and fertilizer dealers probably won't come spread for you. You're going to have that, dump loaded and spread it yourself. A four-wheeler can work if you're, if you're really small. A small tractor can do it as well.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. Now that we know everything there is to know about pasture.
No, but you're welcome to call me. So thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. All right. So now that we have chatted a little bit more about pasture quality, now we're going on to what can happen that's bad stuff about dealing with pasture management. So again, I'm a small ruminant veterinarian, so I deal only with small ruminants, so sheep, goats, llamas, and alpacas for my farm call practice, which is Bluestone Vet. So I have a fun experience with managing parasites, with going through everything with my clients. And, like Jennifer said with her pasture lecture, obviously this is insufficient time to cover all of this. But I do hope that we can touch some important points so that you can at least get to thinking and be like, wow, I never heard about that. I can look that up or talk to my vet about that, or, join some sort of discussion on learning more about things that you might not have known about. Because it is important for your herd and flock health, and you need to know some basic things about those parasite cycles to help you interject in various spots in that cycle to help break that cycle and to help solve some problems if you're having parasite issues. And know that there are other things than chemical dewormers that can help control parasites in small ruminants. And then obviously you'd like to know, okay, I've identified some parasite problems, and what am I dealing with? And with this specific parasite, how can I control that? Why should we care? I mean, I think everybody here cares about sheep and cares about parasites. And you know this, it's a lot of production loss if you are pouring feed into these animals and they are getting so much competition with their parasites that they are not putting that into milk or fiber or muscle. It takes a lot of time to treat these animals, to find these sick animals, to buy all the stuff that's, supply chain issues that you can't get anymore. And know that every chemical dewormer that you use in these animals has some sort of meat and milk withholding time. So that's important when you're marketing a product of meat or milk. And it becomes really critical to try to prevent use of these chemical dewormers by proper management. And obviously vet visits, nobody likes those. And certainly we can have animal losses. I think there was a study out of one of the state vet schools out, maybe Georgia, that maybe 90% of the necropsies, so the postmortem examinations of sheep and goats that came through their necropsy floor, 90% were death due to parasites. So it's a big deal. And we also want, to consider animal welfare. Jennifer mentioned we are stewards of the land. We are also stewards of these animals. We are capable of controlling everything for these animals, what food they have access to, how high quality their pasture is. So it's not their fault if they're dying of parasites. We need to work better at helping them through it. So thinking about parasites and how to detect them. Obviously, everybody mostly thinks about diarrhea. My sheep has diarrhea, she must have parasites. And that is absolutely a big sign that your sheep might have parasites. Poor body conditions. So remember, with body condition in sheep and goats, we're not looking at how big the stomach or abdomen is. Remember, they're ruminants, so they have a huge vat of fermentation in their stomach, and they can be starving, trying to eat hay and trying to eat straw that has no nutrition, and have a big belly, but they don't have that muscle tone. And that picture in the center on the bottom is a good example of poor body condition. So that doe on the left, you can see her hip bones, you can see her spine, you can see her ribs. Much easier on goats, obviously, than sheep, unless you've got hair sheep. So that doe on the left is starving, and that kid on the right is doing fine. And the sad story about that is that doe on the right, on the left, is the mom of that kid on the right. So she is putting all of her energy into him and into his milk, and she's doing well by him, but she's putting it all out. So she needs some help. That picture on the right is, again, feeling that sheep. So you've got to physically get your hands on these sheep to assess the body condition score. Even if you think they don't have a ton of wool, you can put your hands on them and be like, wow, I just feel all the vertebral processes and all the ribs, and I didn't even know. So it absolutely involves touching your sheep, and that might be challenging if you don't have handling facilities. So work on that, work on a crowding pen at least, that you can really feel things. And then, the hot topic is always this pale mucous membranes, the FAMACHA score. So on the left, we're looking at a chart that was made by some guy named Mr. Fama. And he created this to detect anemia in sheep and goats. And anemia is caused by a parasite we're going to talk a lot about later. But you can't actually look at like the gums of sheep and goats. A lot of times they're pigmented. And so we look at the lower eyelid, like the conjunctiva color, to determine how much blood they've got circulating in their system. And obviously, knowing an animal has parasites by fecal testing is the gold standard, of course. And that is where we submit a stool sample, and the lab comes back with a value of X number of eggs of parasites, different parasites. It breaks it all down per gram of feces, and there are certain thresholds. Quantitative fecal testing is really helpful and really important, and not enough people do it because of the cost. So it takes time and it takes money to send it off to your vet or send it off to a lab. It is something that you can learn how to do in your farm. And it's just incredibly helpful when you can do it at your own farm. And that's what part of the workshop will be showing tomorrow in Echo Valley Farm, because it is something that you can do at home with very few pieces of equipment. And in, again, in veterinary perspective land, sick animal visits are a huge part of my practice, and a lot of those sick animals end up being parasites. And remember, there's no magic chemical dewormer that I have that you don't. So all of the chemical dewormers out there have been around for years, and resistance to all of them is around for years, and I don't have any magical things. So client education is a huge part, and just trying to work through things and say, okay, this animal had a bad outcome potentially, but it's now a signal that the rest of your herd might be in trouble and we need to move on that. So a strongyle is a type of roundworm. So we use it broadly for sort of your general internal parasite. So it comes with this life cycle. And I know you're like, why do I need to be looking at this? But it's important, again, for those, every one of those little arrows, we can potentially do something to change that life cycle. So say we'll start with eggs in the feces. So again, the sheep poops the eggs out in the little manure balls. They hang out in the pasture. Inside there's little eggs that hatch. They're called L1s, or first stage larvae. The little larvae hang around in the feces. They eat the bacteria. They have a lovely little environment. They shed into this L2, also hanging around the fecal balls, munching on everything, growing big and strong. L2 then goes into this L3 phase, which is actually the only one that's infective. So if a sheep eats an L1 or an L2, it's not going to get a parasite from that. They're not protected. But L3 is the life stage that they can then become infected. So the sheep eats that. These L3s live on the grass, and so they're little wiggly worms that crawl up and down the grass blades, depending on the temperature, depending on the moisture content. Generally, they can only go 1 to 2 inches up and down that piece of grass, and that feeds back into Jennifer's discussion about pasture length. So if your pasture is 8 inches to start and you graze it down to 4 inches, that's great. They're not going to get a lot of parasites in that because the larva can't crawl up that whole thing. Versus if you're using overgrazed pastures, they're short, they're eating essentially on the ground, they're going to ingest a lot of those L3s and get infected. So it's not only for pasture health to leave that grass length a little longer, it will also help you in reducing your parasites. Once that L3 gets eaten by that sheep, it sheds into L4 and starts munching away on various internal body parts. Mostly it's the intestine, they're attached to the intestinal wall or colon wall, munching on, all the mucus and proteins there. They're also in the abomasum, which is the stomach that's more similar to our stomach. It's the acid stomach. So wherever their specific life cycle makes them, they then complete that cycle into the L5, which is the adult. And those are the ones that can then pass on eggs in the feces. So again, those L4s and L5s are between. Then there's that little word there that's called hypobiosis. And hypobiosis is a thing that most strongyles can do, which arrests their development. It's sort of hibernation, if you think of it. So what an L5, say barber pole homunculus, can do in the winter is it knows that it's 10 degrees outside. And if it comes out as an egg, none of those eggs are going to survive. So they go into this hypobiotic state where they burrow into the wall of the intestine or the stomach and hang out until magically it's spring. And they're like, okay, it's good to come out now. And then they start shedding eggs again. So we will see on fecal egg counts low values in the winter, And that's not necessarily because the eggs are gone and they've all, the worms have all died and we're going to start spring clean. They're hiding. They're way smarter than us. And so they just hang out until it's time to come out again. So we find that, March, April, when the babies are getting born, we'll see a huge increase in the eggs. And again, we're in the Northeast here. And so at least the pastures are generally clean in the spring, but the sheep are not clean. Those sheep will have parasites in them that are just hiding. It's important to know the timeline of this. So again, there's a lot of talk about, wait 10 days between pasture rotations or 2 weeks between pasture rotation. And it all kind of depends on the weather, like Jennifer said. But again, so the development of the hatched eggs to the infective larva usually takes about 7 to 10 days, but in cooler weather, it can take 2 months. Those infective larvae, those L3s, can survive for months. They love 65 to 85 degrees. Generally, they'll die at sustained above 95s, but they can go for a long time. In general, they're considered infective for about 2 months. So, and the nice temperate weather and moisture is really helpful for them. And then again, once that infective larva is ingested, it takes about 3 weeks for it to molt into the stage that they're now shedding eggs. So that makes life difficult as a pasture management, right? Because if you end up rotating them just according to timeline, you might be moving animals into a pasture that has been grazed previously this year, and they're hitting that L3 stage larva at peak infection. So keep that in mind in terms of that. And unfortunately, it goes back to Jennifer, you're going to have to mow between, because it's not good for the pasture to let it go 60 days and not do anything to it. Things that we can do about some of these life cycle pieces here are for that shedding of those eggs in the feces. There's copper oxide wire particles. We'll talk more about those. Nutrition, genetic selection. There are animals that are just better at fighting parasites in their gut, and they will pass that genetics on. There is a vaccine against homuncus in Australia, the barber pole worm. Those larvae in the field, there's things called nematode trapping fungi, and they just hang out and trap those little larvae and eat them quite happily. Again, kind of back to Jennifer, raking pastures, mowing, breaking up those piles of manure so that those little baby L1s and L2s, which are not protected against the environment, dry out is helpful. And then those L3s, how do you limit that from being eaten? And we will talk about more mixed species grazing, stocking density, condensed tannins. Those are the Sericea lesperdeza, forage lengths, pasture rotation, and zero grazing. So everybody knows about the chemical dewormers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Just realize that there are three. There are 3 classes, period, and nothing in the works. One class is the ivermectin. So ivermectin, moxidectin, which is sidectin. The second class are those white dewormers, fenbendazole and albendazole. And then the third class includes levamisole. And again, you can use fenbendazole and then switch to albendazole. And if they're resistant to that fenbendazole, that safeguard, they're going to be resistant to valbazin too. So if you're finding resistance, you have to switch classes rather than a different product within that. Now, theoretically, sidectin, which is the newest moxidectin, is supposed to be used when they are resistant to ivermectin. So it can be helpful, but everything else, again, you have to switch classes. Administration route, it's really important to give these orally. So spend the money, buy the ivermectin sheep drench. It's a big volume. It's, I think, 16 mils per 100 pounds. But giving it directly orally limits contamination of the meat in terms of, we know that these parasites are getting this high dose of that dewormer orally, and then it's gone and out of their system. When we're giving injections of dewormers like ivermectin, that fades with time, and it fades sort of slowly with time. And that slow decrease in concentration of that drug when you give it injectably exposes those parasites to non-lethal doses, non-lethal concentrations of that drug, which promotes resistance. So you do want to try to stick with the oral versions. One of the questions at the signups was, what about new animals to your herd? Ideally, you would be testing their fecals when they come in to see if they have a high load. Again, you're buying that animal's parasites as well. And so you really want to ask that breeder what dewormers they use. Will they tell you if they've seen any resistance? You need to do fecals on any of those new animals that you're really worried about or are high value to make sure that you're not adding resistance to your current flock. There's ways to improve the effectiveness of chemical dewormers. So you're like, Safeguard just doesn't seem to be doing it. It helps, but it doesn't seem to be making the effect that it used to. If you ask your veterinarian, there might be a different dose of that medication. Some of these have dosage ranges through a veterinarian. You can try fasting those animals for 12 hours. That increases absorption because it sort of slows down the gut of the animal. Again, use a proper oral dosing syringe. Don't like suck it up with a 60 ml catheter tip syringe and then it's all over you and all over the sheep. Like make sure that actual dose is getting to that sheep, and make sure you're using the right dewormer for your herd. Just because it works over across the river does not mean that that is the best dewormer. Again, if you're seeing resistance, consider multiple classes, but be cautious because once they're resistant to those 2 classes, they're not going to be unresistant ever. Again, you don't want to rotate just willy-nilly. Those dewormers, you want to wait until you're not seeing that effect. You don't want to just use them all the time. Which animals to deworm? The FAMACHA system is all about only deworming those animals that need it to save the animals that aren't being exposed to these chemicals to shed those parasite eggs that are still susceptible to whatever you just dewormed. And it is important not to deworm everybody and then move them to a clean pasture, because even the best dewormers are maybe 95% effective at killing worms and shedding the eggs. And so if it's 95% effective, they're still shedding 5% of eggs that are just survived that treatment. And now you're moving them to a new pasture, and all of that pasture is now infected with resistance. So deworm, keep them in that pasture for a little bit longer, and then move them. So with the life cycle, trying to affect that internal parasite load, again, some of those options we talked about are the wire particles, nutrition, genetic selection, and vaccines. I'm not going to mention much about the vaccine. It's just that one to the lower right. It's just used in Australia. It's specifically against homuncus. We can't get it here, and it's not terribly effective in the field, and it needs like 5 to 6 boosters a growing season. So that didn't end well, but a good thought. Genetic selection, again, there's no DNA test for parasite resistance at this time, but you can do your genetics in your own herd and see, just keep good records, know who you treated and who you didn't have to treat, and go from there. Nutrition, healthier animals will be more able to fight these infections. So if they're already getting poor nutrition, they're going to have a harder time with parasites, and it's sort of like a vicious cycle kind of thing. Copper oxide wire particles were initially made for goats for copper deficiency, but because homuncus, contortus, barberpole, we'll talk about that, is such a big issue, they also found that it actually helps specifically, again, with just homuncus. So copper oxide wire particles physically damage that larva of that homuncus, that barberpole worm, and break it up in the abomasum. It doesn't do anything against any of the other parasites. And you have to use extreme caution with sheep and copper. The smallest size is a 2-gram bolus. 0.5 to 1 gram is generally what I would recommend in a sheep, and I would still be nervous about it. Larva on pasture, there is a commercially available nematode trapping fungi called Bioworma that you can buy for like $400 on Premier One. And so essentially you feed that. So you feed that in the concentrate of the animal. It passes through the small intestinal tract without doing anything in the animal, and then they poop it out. And it's pooping out these little fungus who are happily like in this perfect environment and eating all the parasite eggs, which is pretty cool and pretty awesome. And it seems to work decently well. in at least experimental conditions. Really, really expensive to do. And it doesn't like then get into your pasture and you never have to do it again. You have to constantly feed that. It's not something that you can manage to get into your pasture. Eating things, eating those L3s. Cattle do not share the same parasites as sheep. And sheep and goats and llamas and alpacas all share the same parasites. So don't think that if you're grazing your goats and then grazing your sheep that you're not sharing parasites. It has to be cattle, horses. That's sort of mostly it. You can graze them together. You can graze them sequentially, but that does. So the cow will eat the L3 larva of that the sheep shed, and it will not become sick with that. It can't develop inside a bovine. So stocking density, Jennifer talked about that. Forage length, Jennifer talked about that. Condensed tannins, again, this is another huge topic that we just don't have time to go into more. Sericea lesperdeza is that picture on the lower left. It's something that contains these condensed tannins that also help decrease worm survivability in the stomach. So chicory, bird's foot trefoil, Sericea are the ones with the big condensed tannins. Sheep tend to have to sort of be trained to eat them. They don't love it. So there's now like pelleted versions of the Sericea. I haven't had a lot of information and knowledge about those. Pasture rotation, we talked about, be careful about the timing, and zero grazing. I think Jennifer had mentioned sacrifice pastures a couple times. So there's a good thing about keeping things in a barn for a while or in a pasture with no grass and just feeding them hay, because you're breaking that cycle. Again, not a ton of time to go over all of the parasites there are a lot. They all do different things. I wasn't even going to mention P. tenuis, Paralaphostrongylis tenuis, but one of the audience members had a question about that. But these are the eggs of all those. They look different. The important thing to know is the strongyles on the bottom are this broad category that all look the same on a fecal. So those fecal tests are going to come back with a strongyle count, and that includes homuncus, but a whole lot of other parasites too. You can't physically look at those eggs and tell them between homuncus and the other ones. So that's a downfall of a fecal test, but there's more knowledge happening with like putting tracers on some of the homuncus to try to figure out what percentage of that total count is homuncus. Homuncus gets all the press because, again, it sticks in the abomasum, sucks their blood. With a bad infection, I mean, look at that. They can remove 1/5 of the sheep's blood volume a day. So that doesn't give you many days to notice something's wrong. And again, it's that paleness, it's that pallor that is the big sign, and they have very high level of resistance to dewormers. We talked about the FAMACHA chart. Again, it's just a scale of how anemic an animal is and trying to figure out who to deworm. So on that little chart, the right-hand side is really, really pink. So that's a healthy animal, so you wouldn't deworm that. And on the left-hand side, that's a very pale animal who's probably going to die, but you'd want to try to deworm them. All the rest of the strongyles do kind of what you'd think they would, poor body condition, diarrhea, weight gain, lethargy. Again, only the homuncus is the one of those strongyles that can cause that, that anemia. I mentioned whipworms. They're really fun to identify on the fecals with that little bulb on each end. I mentioned whipworms because they can cause anemia in some animals, and sometimes where we've had clinical anemic animals, we do a fecal count and the strongyle count is low, and yet they have a decent number of whipworms. And that would be something that would be notable and something you want to know about. Lungworms are fun on fecals because that picture on the left, so that's the little worm like inside the egg, and it like wiggles in there. Like it's not just these little balls of stuff, like it's moving inside those eggs, which is a lot of fun to see. Lungworms, chronic cough, usually young animals. Safeguard is something that kills them. Liver flukes we see in this area, that's horrendous. That picture on the right is a liver with those flukes. They're giant, and then they're challenging to control. So definitely talk to your veterinarian if you ever have sudden death, or if your carcasses have been diagnosed with liver fluke abnormalities, something important to work through. Tapeworms, everybody gets very excited about tapeworms because they can see them. You don't have to have a microscope to look at the eggs. Tapeworms are like totally not pathogenic in most instances. Like you can have a horrible infestation of tapeworms and be fine. So people get very excited about it. You know, albendazole, valbazin, and fenbendazole take care of those, but not really productionally important. They're a fun egg on that left little triangle. P. tenuis, that's a parasite of deer, white-tailed deer, that does just fine in deer, completes its life cycle. In any other species, it's get really confused and lost. So it crawls around the spinal cord or the brain and causes some significant damage, usually hind end paralysis, sometimes more weird neurologic signs. Sheep and goats are fairly resistant to it, but can be affected by it. Alpacas and llamas are extremely susceptible to it, to the point where alpacas and llamas need ivermectin injections every 30 days to make sure they don't get, that any traveling P. tenuis larva will be killed. Now, if you've got a guardian llama in your sheep, you're giving that guardian llama ivermectin every month. He's shedding that resistant strongyles to ivermectin in the rest of your pasture, and the sheep are potentially being exposed to that. So something you should know, but there's just nothing you can do about it. The alpacas need it. Coccidia is a management problem. It's those thin diarrhea kids and lambs. And, you know, you just want to make sure that they're being fed off the ground, that you're trying to minimize fecal contamination into food and water. So, you know that was fast, and I know there's a lot, and hopefully you learned a little bit of something. I mean, the good news is there's a lot of ways that we can interrupt those cycles. And hopefully you've gotten to know a little bit about some of them. But the bad news is it's really hard. Like all of these require constant surveillance of your animals, feeling them, looking at their eyelid color, assessing their body condition. And those parasites are adapting almost faster than we can do it. You know, I think Sidactin was out maybe 2 to 6 months before resistance was found down south. I mean, at least we have a hard winter where our pastures are clean coming into the spring. But again, they get contaminated pretty quickly. So parasites can be a big issue. There's this website called Wormex Info. That is a wonderful website made by folks that have all sorts of information and articles about everything I talked about. And so they're a great resource, and they've also got some links to online FAMACHA certification courses, and that can be really helpful. Sorry guys that went long, but there's just a lot. But any questions can go in the chat box, and really appreciate you guys and your time. Otherwise, it's almost Brent's turn. There were a lot of questions. Everybody did a really good job when they were signing up for the class about all their interests in parasites. And it was great to see those questions. Everybody had really good questions, and I tried to touch on those and tell Jennifer which ones to touch on, and she did that as well. But there's lots of good questions out there. And if you've got specific ones, just let us know. So rotational grazing, what other species are recommended with sheep and goats? So certainly ducks and poultry don't share the same parasites as sheep and goats. So ducks, I know, can be good for cleaning up the snails and slugs from some of the P. tenuis and some of the liver flukes. So that would be a potential good use. I don't know if the poultry eat those infective larvae or eat any of those strongyle eggs. I mean, it's theoretically possible. The hard thing is, I think, if you have enough poultry to intensively manage the larva, I think it would be hard on that pasture without some rest time. So yeah, cattle for the most part. Oh, cocktails of dewormers. That's like makes my heart just stress out. So cocktail of dewormers, that's probably going back to, Jerry, is it a specific like albendazole plus, or is it different dosages? I mean, it makes me think that okay, Cydectin isn't working for you, so
Yep.
try Cydectin plus albendazole
Plus ivermectin, or
Yeah.
yes, and that's what's. I'm close to the Mason-Dixon line, so it's somebody from Maryland who Susan Chamian. I don't know if you know her, but the parasite expert down here, who's now telling us that the only way is, aside from the non-chemical suggestions you made, is that we have to use a cocktail because Cydectin doesn't work. But I just stopped breeding sheep that were not strong.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. So that absolutely. So when we find that maybe one parasite or one dewormer is maybe only 50% effective now, if we combine that with another class like levamisole, we find that it overall the results are improved versus using each one differently. So yeah, so sometimes if you use combinations of these dewormers, it can help you with the scary knowledge that once that doesn't work, like you're just out of chemicals to do, and then you put them on a slatted floor and they never touch grass again. But that's great that you then were like, okay, I'm going to not breed these animals that I'm deworming 5 times a year, and it's not working. So so that's really, really good. Any other questions before we go to Brent? And again, I'm excited. A bunch of you are going to be at the workshop tomorrow, and we can absolutely go over more questions that you guys have, or really focus on what you're interested in terms of knowledge or practice of parasite management. So, all right. Take it from here, Brent.
Thank you. Alessandro's going to help me share my screen. I've never done this before.
Should just be a
Green button.
yeah, try it.
Nope.
Yeah.
I
No.
think you're allowed, so it should still
No.
work.
Open system preferences.
No, I think you have to highlight this and then do this. Yeah, now. That one?
In the bottom of your screen, in the middle, should be a green little box.
Oh my goodness, and
no.
he's the expert.
There you go.
No, because let me see.
And then you click on your presentation and then click share.
No, because it.
Well, in the meanwhile, I felt like Gillian and Jen were looking over me with a school marm look during their speeches, because it's been quite a year for me. Come on
Yes.
now.
Allow share to share screen. With December security privacy to grant access.
You don't want to do it.
Hold on. Privacy.
If it says you don't have access, I can try making you the host, which might give you, you should be allowed. Everybody else, Jen
Oh,
did.
He says, okay, let's see, privacy, Zoom, general.
Well, we had all this figured out 30 minutes ago.
You can also potentially start chatting, and you can email me your PowerPoint, and I could potentially open it, and you can just tell me when to click through. I know it's probably a big file, but
Yeah, no, I think, let me see, try again, share.
Can I just put my PowerPoint on mine and then I just talk through it instead of showing the slides?
No,
Worst case scenario.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. We'll
Your
give
knowledge and brain is the most important thing.
Oh
really.
yeah. Well, then we're in for a treat.
Share. Okay.
Considering
open
how it's going so far.
security and privacy to
So when I do go through my slides, as Alessandro's trying to get me a screen up here, keep in mind that I do watch about 250 sheep every day running everywhere, and that's how my mind works. So that's how my slides will go. I'll try emailing this to you as well, Gillian, just because.
Oh, maybe like this.
Oh, that's not good. Okay, well,
Oh, click the lock. Okay, sorry. Okay. Now you use your password.
Mamma mia.
Okay, okay, good. So we'll not be able to record the contents. Okay, quit.
Can we do it? Or should I just start going here?
I think we've done it. Okay, let's try it now. Yeah.
Oh,
Okay,
well then.
so you are this one, right?
hope
Share.
so.
Yeah, share, and then you go.
Have we got
Perfect.
something?
Yes.
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 All right. Well, I am sorry that took forever. Hold on, just make sure I can move the screens. Okay. So my name is Brent. Thanks very much for joining us. Sorry about that little delay. Alessandro made sure he stuck around just in case I did have a trouble. I'm good. Thanks. So I'm up here in Cooksaki, and this is all a learning for me. On the main screen, I said getting back to grass-fed, and that's because I was grass-fed for 25 years without really considering myself or thinking about it being grass-fed. I was up in the mountains of Italy before moving here for 25 years, and I was raising sheep and making cheese up there in Caprese Michelangelo, and we didn't have fences, so that's my farm that you see on the screen there. And the mountain had 35,000 acres that I was allowed to go on. Not that we obviously did with all that. But it did provide for new pasture, easy pasture, fresh grass. The sheep basically just went where they wanted, and I'd follow and bring them home at night. So with that, we never had to, I never added grain to the sheep's diet. Everything was straight off the mountain. There was no money for it, and it was a bit harder to get. And then 2004, bought another farm, a dairy farm down in a little farther down the mountain. And I did start feeding pellets for the first time. And that was for the goats on the milk stand. So one of the benefits, we never had internal worms. Can anybody hear me?
Yes. Yep. You're great.
Okay, good, good. Where was I? I never had to deal with internal parasites, which is why I was just listening to Gillian's conversation and Jennifer's conversation about the pastures, because this is completely new to me, dealing with these sick animals. Then our market over there, it's very traditional country, so we had to have our Easter lambs ready for Easter at the 25 to 40 pound range. So they were young, and they would be shipped off, and then we'd start milking out on the mountain until August, September, whenever they dried up. Hand shearing was done in June. Never sold a piece of wool. It was always stuffed under olive trees for fertilizer. So completely different world than what I'm in here now. Started a long time ago. Picture me 1991. Do not do the before and after, please. I grazed from basically 1,500 feet up to 3,300 feet. So we did have some mountain cool, even though it was extremely hot and dry, and the pastures did turn golden yellow. I was one of the 14 roaming shepherds in the village when I moved there. And when I left, sadly, there was only one guy left, a friend of mine, Cesare. So it's a tradition that's leaving us, unfortunately. As I mentioned, the grass shortages July and August. I never wormed in my 25 years there. We didn't do the fecal sampling. I did have vets coming out frequently for the things, but we never had to worm. Let's see. We did have snow in the winter. Nice, from October to May, there was third of snow, but never the low temps here in New York. So that's taken some getting used to. And then first cut hay, we never got a second cut, never hoped to get a second cut because there's just no growth in our area. Then we had a big change, culture and pasture shock, moving to New York. It's extremely humid, beautiful green grasses through the summer, which I was not used to. Usually consistent rain for pasture regrowth and haymaking, again, which I was not used to. These lovely internal parasites, which I did not have a clue what to do with. And we've had this farm 7 years now. and it's been a big learning curve. I'm on it, but it's been a tough road on a couple of years. The constant monitoring of the flock, the FAMACHA looking for weak animals. I do my fecal counts here. I have a microscope and figured out how to do that. So I do try to keep on top of it that way. There's such a big need for hay, which again, I wasn't used to. And of course, something we all deal with, frozen pipes, no plowing. Much easier. A plus side, it's so much easier to market lambs, transport animals, dispose of animals. The animal IDs here, which I found ridiculously lax and easy, because when you're used to a system where you cannot move any animal without doctor's permission, that was tough. Little overview of the farm here. So I'm coming at this from a very large piece of property, and it's got its blessing and its curses. And managing this much land with a few hundred sheep, it's tough. So breakdown, we have about 60% wooded, which I do graze, so a little pasturing, but that's with me taking the sheep out there. We have about 20% of pastures, which have been abandoned about 30 years. So there is a lot of growth. The last guy who owned this farm for 30 years, he liked the natural look. So all the thistle, all the raspberry bushes, all the young tree growth was all over my pastures here. We have 15% hay fields and about 5% in steeps and water. There were no fences when I got here. We do have big farms. It's a nice farmy block, which I know down in Dutchess County, it just looks more farmy to me because you're so open. Here in Cooksaki, we're just a mile from town, and we have 4 or 5 big farms right around me. It's a great neighborhood. We have 10 barns of various states here on the farm. We've redone 5 of them, and I use them all for sheep. It's a half-mile walk from the farm where I'm sitting right now to the far barns, which I'll show you on a map. I call them far barns. It's part of the farm, but he bought other farms that got broken up. I've added about 20 fenced paddocks so far. Always reading, always going on the YouTube, trying to figure out what other people are doing with these pastures. And I've spent some money, I spent a lot of time and broke my back, but the more fenced paddocks I have, the better the pastures, the faster the improvement on them. The original plan here was I came to milk cows and goats, making the cheese in Italy for so long. We're going to do the same plan here, milking cows in the winter, goats in the summer, and sheep grazing on the side. I've always had sheep, so I had a nice flock of 60 or so when I got here. And I can say the pastures were in great shape when I had the cows, goats, and sheep all rotating either together or separately. They just seem to take care of worms and unwanted grasses better than sheep alone. I was the cheese went the way of the COVID. In the middle of COVID, with restaurants closing and whatnot, I said adios to the cheese making, and it was very sad, but I'm very, very happy with my sheep now. So I upped my sheep numbers, and now I'm full-time sheep only. We do have a farm store, and I have 2 farm markets a week. That's just the overview of the farm and what I'm having to face every day. And my sheep figures. Right now, I've got 254 sheep on the farm. That's down from a high of about 350. I'm raising white Dorpers. This year, I'm lambing in February, May, September, and December, and that does get challenging for space. I'm trying to pay for this with a lot of sheep, so and they can off-season breed. So you start thinking of how many lambs you can get out of this many sheep breeding 2 times, 3 times in 2 years. Don't get hooked on that, at least in my case, because I run out of barn space, and also my rotational pastures, which we'll talk about again. I can't run just one mob. I have to have several mobs, and that messes me up. Most of my lambs go to the farm store through the farm markets, selling packaged cuts. We also sell quite a few whole and half lambs. Privately, we also sell live animals. We have olive oil in our store from Italy. I do sell a nice number of replacement ewes. I'm not quite where I want to be with a breeding program. I've only, had this going pretty seriously 4 years or so. So I'm not pretending that we're where we need to be, but we do have a nice market for ewe lambs. Extra market lambs I sell to auctions only during peak holiday periods because the money fluctuates so bad. And then the cold lambs I sell as needed. And I've just had to start because my oldest ones are 7 years old. So fencing, what I put up, what seems to work for me, page wire. It's pretty easy. It's getting expensive. I can put it up by myself, got to string it tight. I do have shedding sheep and they will use that as a back scratcher. So unless your page wire is tight, you're going to have some bulge in it. Thankfully, right before all these problems happened in the world, I bought a bunch of metal cattle panels, which I love. They're strong. I can put them up by myself. They're removable. You know, I can sell them if I need to. They're real expensive now. The electric netting, it's easy in the spring. I find it easy in the spring. Sheep respect it easily. They learn to it quickly. It's nice to do small portions of my lawn with it, but with so many sheep, you know, I have to move it a lot, and it's not my favorite thing to do is pick that up and fold it and take it out and set it up again. Single strand hot wire takes a lot of training. Short area, 3 strands, very hot. Let them get zapped. It only takes one time. Then eventually expand the area, take down a wire, take down the second wire. And then anybody who just continues to escape, just get rid of them if that's your preferred way. And that is the easiest, I have to say. Then I do take my sheep out every day. You know, I was used to it in Italy, just following sheep along. So it doesn't faze me in the least to take 300 sheep out on the roadway and eat the sides and get some free grass. So that's my fencing and control system. So here's a little overview of the home barns. I call it, you know, the home farm and the far barns. So this is where I am rotating. The pasture one that you see there in the middle, that's more of a sacrifice pasture. And then I do not go in order of the numbers on here because some are bigger, some are smaller. I can't do what I want, what I think in my head is going to be able to do. So I made 16 paddocks. I started grazing on May 8th, which was a bit late because I could keep sheep in a pasture for 3 or 4 days. And by the time you do that for 10 pastures, your other pastures are so high, they start to become unedible. So the goal was to give 1 or 4 days grazing, depending on the paddock size. And that would give me 35, 40 days of set aside time to help with the worm population and to get some regrowth. Smaller pastures, as I mentioned, are much faster in pasture improvement. I do graze roadsides and woods, as mentioned, to save some pastures when I do see them getting dry, like this year, which is challenging. Like I said, I graze whatever is ready, no particular order, but I do keep track of where I've been to not go back there trying to break worm cycles and give it a rest. Let me see. Yeah, easy to follow. So part of my I really like animals and spending time with animals, and it's just my nature to see what they're doing. I'm trying to be a concierge. They don't speak English, so I got to figure out what they want. So I watch a lot. I'm not allowing sheep to graze down too far. I know we talked about some, you know, grazing short pasture, and I just have this, being new to the worm thing, I just have this fear of them eating too many worm eggs, so I don't let it get down too far for them. I do take note of what parts of the pastures and what pastures sheep like or don't like, or what they're avoiding. And I'm working on some pasture improvement with fertilization and replanting and plowing up an area or two if I need to. Concerning worms, I try not to graze the same pasture more than 4 days, just because, you know, I read so much about hatching cycles and when goats and sheep can be reinfected. So I try not to let them have more than 4 days. But now that Gillian's telling me also their hatching times can be 2 months later, that's going to put me in a tailspin tonight. Thank you very much. Ideally, I would like to make some alleyways. If we go back to that map later on, I don't have alleyways from farther pastures back to the barn. So I do have to retraverse some of the pastures that I've already eaten. I also don't have water in all of my pastures. Some days I don't worry about it when it's, nice and dewy. But, I do get them up to the barn once a day so they can have a good drink off. Let me see. And this year that it has been so dry and it hit me pretty hard and fast, I have had to keep sheep in barns quite a bit. I'm willing to do that sacrifice, but it was a bad year, as we all know, hay wise. We're not going to get a second cut. First cut was so expensive, and I'm feeding 2 bales a day right now. And so, yeah, that'll keep me up tonight too. Great. And also listening, loud sheep are not happy sheep. So if you put your sheep in a pasture and it's just they're talkity, something's not working for them. So watch and listen. So these are the far barns I was talking about. So the lower square on the bottom, that's the home barns that I was just showing you. Then that long red line going to the top of the page. In that break of the line, that's a hay field, which I hayed this year, only got 19 round bales out of it. And that's my only traverse to go to the far barn pastures. So I did not cross that hay field in the hopes of getting some hay. But by the time we got that cut and got my sheep into the top pastures, you see those 4 or 5, and those are big pastures. The grass was waist high. And so I did make a mistake on that. And I'll be on that bush hog a lot more, or I'll start the mob at the far barns and get them 1 or 2 days on each pasture, get it cut down, and then move them home. And then I'll just sacrifice that hayfield next year. I'll buy the 19 rather than, let the whole farm go up. Moving back and forth is easy. I don't mind going from the far barns to the home barns every day. It's a half mile, which, there's a little trail through the woods. It's very pastoral. I enjoy that. I am going to use the hayfield, as mentioned, as a pasture next year. So I'm not going to risk one side of the farm getting tall and over dried and burdocky or whatever it is, and the other side getting short. That unfortunately happened this year, and I thought I was on top of it. So it's all a learning curve. Doing this 31 years and back to school. So part of my goals, I should say here, I'm not going for 100% grass fed. I will use creep feed if I need it, or somebody needing some extra boost. But you do save money. I do have a lot of land, so let's make it pay for itself. The small paddocks, they do eat down and they get more efficient. It improves the pastures. Obviously, we mentioned that a few times. Better health for my animals. The farm is big, so that's for myself as well. If I have to move them, I'm moving. The sun and the wind, natural living, and they're less stressed. Working with a team is a pleasure for me, so I don't mind walking a bunch of sheep with bells a mile or 2 down the road. The more I got them outside, the less I'm cleaning inside. Easier management. This winter, as soon as the ground freezes, I'm going to try to feed every day outside. I'll find a patch of pasture that needs some improvement, and I'll roll out my hay and hope that we can get some improvement that way. Then, having all these animals outside, it's, we do this because we love it. None of us are going to make $1 million raising sheep. It's just a source of pride. And seeing them out there is a whole different story than going to somebody's barn and seeing them inside. And nothing against barn raising. It looks so easy. I watch all those YouTubes and want to do it just like that. So the worms and parasites that Gillian had mentioned, the barber pole, I have had some trouble with Mr. Barber. So he does, he's my biggest challenge. Well, at least I think he's my biggest challenge. Staying ahead with proper pasture rotation. I use a lot of diatomaceous earth if I do have a sick one that's not overly sick. I can pull her aside and throw her in the hospital pen and use some DE on the feeds, and I've had good luck with that. Good for small groups. Obviously, a big group doesn't work too good. I do thankfully avoid full flock wormings and wasting the money that way. And it is, you do see a couple, and I have to say, there's the strong urge sometime to put 300 in the chute and worm them all. Again, I'm a big observer, so I easily see weak animals quickly, and that does help. So I can get them separated and have a look at them, get them off the pastures. I do use chemical wormers when needed. I try, like she said, I do fast them beforehand. I do use a white and a clear together, and she may have something to say about that. That's a Dr. Google solution. And I'm getting better at culling. I can't waste time on them anymore. If I have 249 healthy ones and one sad and wormy that I have to treat over and over, she's going. Fresh pastures, rotation, the mineral availability. This year I went through a lot of minerals with the hot water, clean water. It's going to result in healthier animals, and they can handle a certain worm load without us reaching for the drench gun every day. And like I said, again, cull the sheep that can't handle the good conditions or normal conditions. So early season, the farm's a party. Life is good. Everybody's getting out of the barn. The discipline, which I have to check myself, is let the grass grow good enough to get a good start, so I'm not killing it on the first grazing. We do have abundant, fast-growing growth with a lot of pastures. I see a lot of green around here. It's normally consistent and cool. I've been here 7 years. This is the first really dry summer we've had, so we've been pretty lucky. You'll notice it, and you probably do notice it, as soon as your sheep go outside, 2-3 weeks later, they just look like a completely different herd of sheep that I thought looked really good when I put them outside. Then the sheep love it. They can't wait for me to open the next gate. So that's the early season party life. And then we have the end of season. Things don't look so good. Like now we're all getting tired. The shepherd, sheep, the pasture, the weather's not coordinating, grasses are slowing. Paddocks are not ready for a second or third turn in the rotation. And that's what I'm going through now. Even with all this land, I don't always have time to take 250 sheep out. And I do it when I can, try to do it every day. But I do have a lot of animals in the barn right now, just waiting for some rain. Moving ground, if you're doing the electric netting, the posts are hard to get in the ground now. I'm not a big, I don't have a love affair with those kind of fences. So, any excuse to complain about them, that's the direction I'm going to go. But they are hard to get in the ground. So keep that in mind if you buy a whole bunch of them. Again, the smell, if you got so many sheep, I'm coming from it with a lot of sheep. So if you have a smaller flock, you may not have to worry about this so much. But each of those hooves is spreading a sheep smell. So if I have 250 sheep in a small paddock, they're not going to eat it. It's just going to stink. And even if there's a lot of grass, they want to move on. So I do have to be wary of that and give them what they want, not what I want. This year I am on the bush hog, as both Gillian and Jen mentioned. It's costly and time consuming, but it is helping. It's setting me up for the next phase. It may not feel like it today, but it is setting me up that, I'm going to be ready for when the growth does start again, because I need to get these animals out there. Weeds are faster growing than the grasses in the season, so I do need to keep on top of those. And don't know what that is. Frequent moving. Now that the hay fields, combining my two farms, the north and the south part, those are cut, I can move frequently back and forth. I'm trying not to do that because of the worm population that I'm trying to keep on. And so a different approach, because I have had my share of the mistakes this year. You think you're doing this for 30 some years and you know everything, and you open the farm and want to show everybody. Then you have a year like this and you just want to spread your arms and not let anybody in the barn. But I do have some things I'm going to change, because we're always changing. That's why we're here, to learn something. I can't read it now. It's getting dark. So my lambing, I'm going to change my lambing. I'm not going to do 4, because 4 lambing groups was a bit too much, because I have to have so many mobs and so many rotational in pastures, and I ran out of pastures. So I took the numbers down a bit. I'm going to have smaller winter lambing groups, a very large lambing group in April, May, to try to get them on pasture. And then another smaller group in the fall of next year. The majority of the newborns will stay on the barn until October, Christmas, unless there's a holiday or somebody wants a smaller lamb. Weather permitting, putting all the sheep together to make the rotation easier, which I just said. I'm going to castrate all the ram lambs. I did not do that this year. Last year, 2022, I had a big market for the Muslim holidays in the summer, and they all said, save me a big one, save me a big one. So I've got about 40 some rams in the barn if anybody needs one. So next year I'm going to castrate everybody and just make the mob grazing easier. I'm not going to add that. You know, if they want to come in, if anybody wants to come and buy, here's what I got. I can't try to point to what they want a year and a half from now. I'm going to do some early marketing of the replacement ewes. I'm not going to keep them so long as I have. You know, I'm letting them stay 5-6 months. Going to start grazing 3 weeks earlier on some of my marginal pastures because, like I said, I started May 8th and I waited too long. By the time they got 2 days in, pastures 10 pastures away were way too high, and that kind of set me up for trying to play catch up. I'm going to do bush hogging immediately after. I'm not going to wait and see what's going to happen. As soon as the sheep are gone, I'm going to bush hog down to that 4, 5, 6 inches, whatever I need to do, in the hopes of killing off some parasites, keeps weeds at bay. I'm not going to make hay on the connector paddock, as mentioned, to use that as my corridor between 2 farms. I'm going to do much quicker culling of sheep having difficulty with so many. You know, we're nurturers and we just want to take care of the sad one. And the sad one's not going to keep this farm afloat. So the sad ones are going to be sadder and they're going to get in a truck. And I'm going to put my attention on the really healthy ones. I'm going to try to stock up on second cutting. It is more expensive. It's more nutritional. We all knew that. I won't have to buy the grains if I have a lot more second cutting. Let's hope for a little more rain next year. As I said earlier, I'm going to roll hay outside for the winter. So that's less indoor work, less dust breathing, hopefully helping the pasture. I have to be more vigilant about my loose minerals. They're always, you know, somehow in the back of the list until you walk by the feeder and go, oh, darn it. But this hot year has really taught me a lesson. I may have a horse trot by here very soon. Yep, he's coming. My goal is not 100%, as I said, but as close to it as possible because I just want my sheep to be in great health. And I want them to be happy that they're here. I always look at it like, if I were a sheep, would I want to live here? And that's normally the case. And that's my info if anybody wants to get in touch. And I hope that wasn't too choppy. Sorry about the beginning. And I'll give this back to Gillian because I don't know how to do it.
That was really perfect, Brent. Thank you. So
Yeah,
yes.
The exit was.
So I hope everybody has gotten a good overview from, you know, pastures to parasites and what it is in actuality. So anybody has any questions for Brent, throw it in the chat and I'll read it to him. But thank you all so much for coming. I think everybody who came at 6 is still here, which is really great. We didn't lose anybody. That's always a good thing.
Here's my horse in case anybody's interested. What just trotted by.
All right. Any questions? Really great speakers. Thank you so much. I certainly learned stuff.
I did
really
too.
Appreciate it. All right, perfect. Well, thank you again so much. Thanks for spending time. Thank you for those who've signed up for the workshop tomorrow. Looking forward to that. And then, you know, come to further, you know, productions that we have with sheep and wool. And we're really excited to have you and let us know what works for you, what you're interested in, and we can always facilitate that. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone.